In her essay Feminism and Critical Theory, Spivak discusses the relationships between feminism, Marxism, psychoanalysis, and deconstruction in literary criticism. These theories define a woman as a man in the texts that form the foundation of their work, questioning the notion of a definitive definition. They argue that no rigorous definition is possible, but they believe that definitions are necessary to keep us going and allow us to take a stand. Text is an area of discourse within the human sciences, where the problem of the discourse is made available. In literary discourse, the truth of a human situation is not always found, but rather played out as the solution. Human textuality can be seen as a representation of a world in terms of a self at play with other selves and generating this representation. This concept of textuality does not mean a reduction of the world to linguistic texts or a tradition composed of books, criticism, and teaching. Marxist or psychoanalytic criticism is a reductive enterprise, but rather as a part of a general configuration of textuality, placing the solution as the unavailability of a unified solution to a homogeneous generating or receiving consciousness. Spivak touches upon the ideas of alienation in Marx and normality and health in Freud, which are often seen as reductive models in the literary critical establishment. Marx's theory of use value, exchange value, and surplus value can be analyzed from a feminist perspective. The traditional social situation of women producing more than they receive in terms of subsistence wages or labor power, leading to the production of surpluses for the man who owns them or the capitalist who owns his labor power. This paradoxical analysis raises questions about the use value of a woman's unremunerated work for husband or family, the ethical charge of Marx's argument, and the implications of denying women entry into the capitalist economy. The idea of externalization or alienation within the capitalist system is of greater interest. The labor process externalizes itself and the worker as commodities, fracturing the human being's relationship to himself and his work as commodities. However, this picture of the human relationship to production, labor, and property is incomplete in terms of the physical, emotional, legal, custodial, and sentimental situation of the woman's product, the child. In both matrilineal and patrilineal societies, the legal possession of the child is an inalienable fact of the property right of the man who produces the child. The current struggle over abortion rights has foregrounded this unacknowledged agenda. To engage and correct the theory of production and alienation, it is necessary to re examine the nature and history of alienation, labor, and the production of property in terms of women's work and childbirth. Freud's notion of pain as the deferment of pleasure can also be viewed through the lens of pain in the womb, a tangible place of production. This deconstructive move will make it harder to devise rules for economic and social ethics. Freud's essay on femininity argues that the determinant of femininity is penis envy. However, Freud does not consider the womb as a place of production, which is a significant gap in his theory. The task of rewriting Freud's text is to make available the idea of a womb envy as something that interacts with the idea of penis envy to determine human sexuality and the production of society. The feminist enterprise should provide evidence to prevent the great male texts from being great adversaries or models for revising or reassessing ideas. By doing so, the common currency of understanding society will change and the understanding of literature as part of the human enterprise will be redefined. The development of a reading method that is sensitive to gender, race, and class is crucial for this change. American feminist criticism should focus on the history of the Third World women and the production of the colonial object through European theories, often through literature. This approach will help to understand the context and substance of literature as part of the human enterprise and challenge the hegemonic first world intellectual practices. Freud's critique today involves a broader critique of his entire project, including nuclear familial psychoanalytical theories of the constitution of the sexed subject. Understanding that the literature of the world is not tied by concrete universals but by a textuality of material, ideological, and psychosexual production is essential for a more inclusive understanding of society. Spivak proposes an analysis of the discourse of the clitoris, which has been met with mixed reactions from American lesbian feminists. Some argue that the clitoris is a shorthand for women's excess in all areas of production and practice, which must be brought under control to keep business going as usual. Spivak acknowledges the historical antagonism between Marxism and feminism, but also acknowledges the conflict between the suffrage movement and the union movement. The essential truth of Marxism or feminism cannot be separated from its history, and that the theory of the imagination in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries can help understand this. They suggest that sexual reproduction is produced by an irreducibly determinate means in an irreducibly determinate mode involving minimal variation of social relations. Spivak discusses the relationship between wage theory and women's theory, focusing on the subversive power of women's work in models for the construction of a revolutionary subject. Negri sees this possibility in the inevitable consumerism that socialized capitalism must nurture. By reversing and displacing this tendency within consumerism, the revolutionary subject can be released. Women's work has continuously survived within various modes of production, and that the power of the domestic economy can be used as a model of the foreign body unwittingly nurtured by the polis. Spivak discusses the role of psychoanalytic feminism in colonialism and Marxist feminism in examining the economic text and the operations of new imperialism. They argue that deconstruction, which involves reversing and displacing historical events, is important in understanding the asymmetry of interest and the hidden ethico political agenda of differentiation constitutive of knowledge and judgment. They also argue that deconstruction will not allow the establishment of a hegemonic global theory of feminism. Spivak examines Margaret Drabel's The Waterfall, which explores concerns of race and class in a non expository way. Drabel's work, which is based on a feminist perspective, presents an extreme situation to answer the question of why does love happen. Spivak suggests that Drabel is taking up the challenge of feminine passivity and making it the tool of analytic strength. The provisional and self-suspending Jane can be expressing her love for James as a miracle and her own creation of solitude and pain. She also suggests that a religion that denied free will and placed God in his true place, like Zeus, would be more effective in addressing these issues. Spivak discusses the concept of love and the reasons behind it. She reflects on the idea of making women rivals in terms of the man who possesses them. The example Spivak cites is an extreme case as it is carried on in a privileged atmosphere. The story of Jane is the most worth telling as she is an impossible princess who mentions that her poems are read on the BBC. Drabble considers the story of a privileged woman the most worth telling as she shares the lightest touch of her parents' prejudice. There is this issue of class and race as Jane is made to share the lightest touch of her parents' prejudice. The text explores the role of Jane as a narrator in examining the conditions of production and determination of microstructural heterosexual attitudes within her chosen enclosure. It emphasizes that there are no fixed new rules in the book, that it is essential to strive for different forms of understanding and change rather than relying on self identical categories of truth. Spivak suggests that the desire to understand and change is both symptomatic and revolutionary, and that filling in the void with rules will not be enough for women and humans. Instead, we must practice a taxonomy of different forms of understanding and change dependent on resemblance and seeming substitutability rather than self identical categories of truth. Drabble's Jane's Way Out seems to be a classical privileging of the aesthetic, as she changes from the third person to the first, revealing the limits of self interpretation through a gesture accessible to humanist academics. This dismissal of narrative speculation about the nature of truth may suggest that there is a way of speaking about truth in truthful language. The risks of the first person narrative prove too much for Drabble's fictive Jane, who wants to plot her narrative in terms of the paradoxical category of pure corrupted love. Returning to the detached and macro structural third person narrative after exposing its limits could be an aesthetic allegory of deconstructive practice. Spivak highlights the importance of returning to the third person with its groundings mind under to better understand and address the issues of race, class, and sex in women's fiction. She also points out the complex relationship between women and privileging of essence in literature and fiction. She discusses the discontinuities and contradictions in assumptions about women's freedom to work outside the house and the sustaining virtues of the working class family. She argues that the nativist argument that do not question third world mores is unexamined imperialism, and that the dynamism and civilizing power of socialized capital are not present in a comrade economy like South Korea. The nuclear family does not have a transcending ennobling power, and the rise of a meritocratic individualism has a relationship to the development of ideology and marriage in the West. Socialized capital has been criticized for its remote control and the killing of women, as seen in the case of control data, where American managers watched as South Korean men decimated their women. The company's radio commercial used the acronym Plato to dissimulate a quantitative and formula permutational vision of knowledge as an instrument of efficiency and exploitation. The acronym Plato shares the historical symbolic value of the project of civilization as such, which is the slave mode of production that underlay Athenian civilization. Derrida's work becomes solipsistic and marginal when he writes under the sign of woman, as he critiques appropriation and the tyranny of the text of the proper. This suppression of the clitoris is illustrated by the news item about control data. Derrida uses an absent, unnamed, and sexually indeterminate woman as a vehicle for reinterpretation of the relationship between Socrates and Plato. Bourgeois feminism can participate in the tyranny of the proper and see control data as an extender of the Platonic mandate to women in general. The dissimulation of political economy is in and by ideology, with nation states, nationalism, and national liberation, ethnicity, and religion at work.